So Jesus left that place and he went to the vicinity of Tyre, and there he went into a house, and he didn't want anybody else to know about it, but he couldn't keep his presence secret. But there was a woman who heard about him from Syrophoenicia, and she was a Greek, not a Jew. And she begged Jesus, having come into the house, to cast the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus responded, "It's not right to give the children's food to the dogs." But the woman responded to him, "But even the dogs under the table eat the food that the children drop." And Jesus replied to her, "For such a reply you may go, the demon has left your daughter." And so she went home, and she found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone.
Maybe that story from Mark's Gospel made you sit up and wonder, what is Jesus saying to this woman? Is he really such a racist? He's turning to a woman described as a Syrophoenician woman, a person who wasn't a Jew, and she's begging him to release her daughter from an unclean or evil spirit, and Jesus responds with the words, "First let the children eat all that they want, for it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." Now, when you think about it, it seems really offensive to this woman, doesn't it? That she's coming begging Jesus for help, and he's basically calling her a dog. Now, is this really what it's about? And anyway, this woman, where is she from? Because in the gospel story, she's described as a Syrophoenician woman, and also in the same story, it says the woman was a Greek. So how can she be both? And then you also get her called a Canaanite in Matthew's Gospel. So Matthew thinks she's a Canaanite, Mark thinks she's a Greek, and she's a Syrophoenician woman. How does all this work out? Well, let's have a think about it for a while. The Phoenicians were a people who had their homeland, as far as we know, that's the place they were mostly based, in the area around Tyre and Sidon, and maybe the city of Byblos, and probably Beirut, in the area that we now call the Lebanon. And they, rather than being based in a territory or a country, their government worked in city-states. So they had a number of cities where the Phoenicians were the rulers and the controllers. And by this time, in fact, a long way back in history, the Phoenician peoples had been famous as seafarers. And they travelled across the whole Mediterranean. And so there were Phoenicians based in Spain, in North Africa, in the very famous city of Carthage, where they were known as Carthaginians, and spoke the language, the Phoenician language, which over there was called Punic. And so they'd spread over the whole world. And first of all, they'd begun by taking their fine ships and trading in cedar and the beautiful woods of the Lebanon, which they'd been able to supply to Egypt and to Mesopotamia and later to the Greeks and to the Romans. But also, because that was about the only thing they had in their country, the only asset, they also learnt to do a lot of other skills. So they were famous for their dyes and textiles, the most famous being the imperial purple, what we called the Tyrian purple, which only they knew how to make. And they also were great glassmakers. They also had created almost like what we would think of like mass production of glass vessels and jars and drinking vessels and all sorts of things, and they exported that over the world. They were also experts at fine metal work. So they were almost, I suppose, like Britain had once been years ago when we were like the workshop of the world. The Phoenicians had those skills and they traded all over the known world. We actually suspect they may have actually traded tin with Britain. So they've got right the way round, but all over the Mediterranean there were Phoenician cities. So when we say somebody's a Phoenician, it's not always terribly clear where they'd come from. But this woman was also a Greek. Now, the Phoenicians, as in most of the people in that part of the world, had been conquered by Alexander the Great. And he brought the Greek language and Greek culture to the whole region. And through a process that we call Hellenization, he'd helped all those areas to adopt a Greek style of culture. And that's one of the reasons why our New Testament now is written in the Greek language, because that was the language that united all the peoples around the East Mediterranean and into what was once Persia and other areas. Of course, they didn't use that language day to day. Day to day, the people in Israel and in the Lebanon would probably have spoken Aramaic, which was the language that they learned under their previous conquest and rules by the Mesopotamian empires. So here's a woman, she's a Greek speaker, she doesn't speak Aramaic like the Jews and the other people in Israel do, and the Jews often refer to anybody who was a foreigner as a Greek. So she may not actually have been born in Greece. Indeed, Matthew says she was a Canaanite woman. And of course, the Phoenicians themselves appear to have come as from a Canaan background, to be part of the peoples that generally occupied in ancient history the area around Lebanon and around Israel and that whole area, probably what we now call Jordan, and the whole area on that eastern Mediterranean seaboard and the region of land inland from it around and beyond the Jordan. So there's this woman, and she comes, and it says Jesus was in the vicinity of Tyre when he met her. So Tyre's one of these Phoenician cities. So maybe she came from that area. She probably grew up speaking Greek, which meant she was probably a well-educated person and knows people from that area. And her response to Jesus might suggest she had a certain amount of wit about her. And her daughter had a demon. Now it's quite interesting because in the Gospels we often find as Jesus goes into the areas around the Lebanon, Syria, the border regions of Israel, in the northern parts of Galilee, or into the region they call the Decapolis, or the 10 towns, which were towns largely occupied by, if you like, foreign peoples, part of the ruling empires of the Romans and the Greeks in the past. Those places were full of people with what we might call, or the Jews might think of as pagan practices. And they were full of encouraging spirits to enter into people so they could tell fortunes, full of begging their gods to possess them. And so it's small wonder that we find again and again in the scriptures that Jesus encounters demons and forces of evil that then turn to oppress people in those situations. So this woman came and she was begging Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. And Jesus responds to her, "Let the children eat all they want, for it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." I sometimes wonder if this was almost like a bit of a common saying that people might use when they were suddenly approached by a beggar. You know, a bit like we might say, well, my duty is to feed my family first, look after the ones that have been given to me. But Jesus was taking it a bit further. He was almost saying, well, look, my work now is amongst the Jews. These are the people I've been called to. This is the work that God's given to me. Now, of course, this is a little bit surprising because we know it was Mark who wrote this down. And when Mark wrote his gospel, he wasn't writing at this time. He was writing later in the context where most of its audience would have been Gentiles and Greek speakers. That's why he wrote in the Greek language. So he was actually writing to the people who might go, what's Jesus saying to this woman? And so what's really important is not the instinctive response, because yes, they would know that Jews don't mix with Gentiles. But what Mark wanted to bring out was that Jesus was here instigating the start of something that was going to change and was going to include his audience in the good things that God gave. So the woman responds to Jesus when Jesus said it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs by saying, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Now, of course, he's not talking about food, is he here? What he's talking about are the good gifts of God that God had entrusted to his people Israel. And it's almost like he's saying, yes. She's saying, yes, Jesus, but a little bit of that spills over to us, doesn't it? And Jesus responds in a very positive way to her. Now, it's really interesting because right through the Gospels, normally when somebody comes and challenges Jesus, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus gets the better of them. But in this case, it's almost like Jesus, for the first time, responds, yeah, you're right. Yes. For this reason and for your reply, you can go. The devil's left your daughter. He's gone out. And she went home and found that the demon had gone, that her daughter was free. So, from Mark's perspective, perhaps the story is not about why the Gentiles and the Greeks and the Phoenicians aren't included, but actually about why they are. And maybe he wants his audience to say, yes, we too can take of those crumbs, which is so much more than what we think we were. Yes, our people were not part of the covenant with Abraham and with Moses and with David and the whole story that led to the coming of the Messiah. But now we're included. And the strange thing was, this was the stage at which the Gentiles were beginning to dominate the church. But perhaps Mark wants to remind them that Jesus himself came as a Jew and that they weren't to think of themselves as somehow superior or strong, but to remember the roots, remember where they'd come from. So maybe instead of a story about racism and Jesus somehow or other having some outdated attitude, maybe it's a story about change, about the first seeds of the change that later took the gospel first to Jerusalem and then Samaria and then to the ends of the earth, and in which there was neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, rich nor poor, but all were one in Christ.
After this, Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. And there some people brought him a man who was deaf, and he could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hands on him. And Jesus took him aside away from the crowd, and then he put his fingers in the man's ears, and he spat, and he touched the man's tongue, and he looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh he said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. And at this the man's ears were opened, and his tongue was loosed, and he began to speak plainly. And Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone. But the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. And people were overwhelmed, and they said, he's done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak.
And so once Jesus had finished with the Syrophoenician woman and cast the demon out of her daughter in that remote way, he left that area and he went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee. And from thence he went into the region of what we call the Decapolis, or the 10 towns. And there some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. Now it's interesting because again we've got some people begging Jesus to heal someone, and they want to heal him from his deafness and his inability to speak. Now, those of us who are involved in the deaf community sometimes get a little bit worried about healing deaf people, because what we really want is for deaf people to be accepted. And sometimes the deaf community can feel very, very oppressed by people who somehow or other always want to change them into hearing people or to make them different. Whereas all the time what the deaf community are often longing for is for their own language, their own culture to be recognised and treated as equal. But we'll come back to that in a moment. But for the moment, let's have a look at how Jesus approached this man. First of all, they came begging him to place his hands on him. Lay hands on, that seems a reasonable way to heal. We know Jesus did that sometimes. We know that was often done as a way of healing in the time and still is today. So it was a reasonable thing for them to ask. But it was very interesting that Jesus didn't respond to them as they thought he would, because they thought there and then he'd place his hands on him and that would be it. But first of all, Jesus took him aside. He took him away from the crowd. Now in Mark's Gospel, Jesus quite often does important things in secret. And it may well be that, just like when he came to Tyre and Sidon, he didn't want anybody to know where he was staying. But Jesus took the man aside from the crowd and he did some very strange things, because we read in the story, he put his fingers in the man's ears. And then he spat and he touched the man's tongue. Now whether he spat on the ground or spat on his fingers and put it on his tongue, I'm not quite sure. And then he made a very strange prayer, because he looked up to heaven and it says with a deep sigh. Now what was that about? There's something deeply emotional about this. he said, Ephphatha. Ephphatha. It almost sounds like breathing out, doesn't it? It sounds like a sigh. But it means, in the language, it means be opened. And we read that at this, the man's ears were open, his tongue was loosed, and he began to speak plainly. So we read before he could hardly speak, so in other words he'd got a very difficult to understand deaf voice, and then he was changed and could speak plainly. Now obviously in the culture of that area at that time, that would have made him a fully involved person, because at that stage they didn't understand as we do about disability access and all those things. Basically, if you had some disability, you couldn't do something in that culture at that time, under Rome and under the Jewish governors and everybody else, you were a beggar. That's how you had to make your living, unless some members of the family were really kind to you and helped you out, or you're of a wealthy background. But even then, you were going to struggle. You weren't going to have the same access as anybody else. So Jesus' healing perhaps has a little bit of a different impact in that society than it would do today, and would have actually made this man's life so much more fulfilled and so much more in it than he had before. But Jesus also commanded them not to tell anyone. But of course what happened was, Jesus said don't tell anybody, people began to tell everyone. And they said he's done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Now of course, one of the things that would have been important for is not so much based on the medical change to the deaf person, but that particular word about making the deaf hear and the mute speak would have been a sign to the Jewish people of the coming of their Messiah. And so this is why Mark tells the story. And also interestingly, a similar miracle like that would often be recognised by many of the Gentile people as a sign of a great person. Now of course it may well be that the people, they came to Jesus not because they recognised who he was or they recognised his teaching, they just saw him as a wonder worker and a healer, so they came for what they needed. If I'm oppressed by demons, yes, he'll release me. If I've got problems with a sickness or a disability, he may heal me from that. But of course in Mark's Gospel it's all about something more. It's all about the coming of God's kingdom and signs that Jesus is the one who is expected. He is the Son of Man, the presence of God coming amongst human beings and bringing us into the purpose of God for our futures. So we have a Gentile woman on the margins of Jewish life who, on the face of it, wasn't even allowed to take the food that was for the children. But she was given it. And we have a man who's deaf and dumb. Maybe someone in his time would think that was a sign that he was somehow cursed, or that he was not allowed to take full part in the worship and the love of God. But Jesus took him and he healed him and he gave him access. So Mark's saying, in the future, to the church that is now, and to the church that will be, all are included in the wonderful work of Jesus. And you can all be part